Hello everybody, welcome to the StoryHolic channel. Today I'm going to tell the story of the movie Dorian Gray, which is a movie based on a dark book with more than a century since its publication. But before I start, leave your like, subscribe and activate the bell notifications so you don't miss any new videos here on the channel. The story begins with Dorian Gray, a nobleman in Victorian England. He lands knife blows on a person we can't see yet, then places the body in a chest and throws it into the sea. After that the movie goes back a year, where we see Dorian just arrived in London. He is a bit lost until one of his servants finds him and takes him to his house. There we found out that Dorian's grandfather had already passed away and he had inherited everything. There he remembers a piano performance he gave and meeting Basil Howard. They become friends and Basil makes several drawings of him. He notices scars on Dorian's back, but decides to ignore it. That same night they go together to a party for the London nobility. Their people put him aside and even laugh at him a little. Except for the host Henry Wotton, who starts talking to him, while offending Dorian's grandfather, saying he even celebrated his death, but ends the conversation respectfully and says he hopes to see Dorian again. The days go by and Basil is doing another painting of Dorian, but this time Henry was there too. Dorian questions the noble's interest in him, but he replies that not everyone he meets is interesting. The three then head to a poorer area of town and enter a bar. In this bar they have a discussion about society's values, kindness and happiness. Dorian seems concerned for his soul, but Henry encourages him to pursue pleasure. Especially after the protagonist misses the chance to talk to a woman at the bar. Time passes and Basil finishes the painting. They are impressed and Henry says it's the best job he's done. And that's better than reality, because the picture will never change, but Dorian would grow old. They start talking about the brevity of life. And Dorian goes so far as to say that maybe he should make a pact with the devil not to grow old. Dorian then puts the painting in the living room and throws a party to show the nobility, complete with photos and all. One night, he decides to walk around town and stops to see a play. He is surprised to find that the bar lady was one of the actresses. Her name was Sybil Vane and he gets the opportunity to meet her. They talk for a while and then get on well. And man, really the days of being romantic and poetic are gone. They meet more often and it really seems like there was a connection between them, but when Dorian tries to kiss her, she asks him to leave. She explains that she is afraid of giving herself up, but he says he loves her and they spend a night of love together. However, Dorian begins to have nightmares where his grandfather found him in the attic and attacked him. The scare was so much that he wakes up breaking the glass with his arm, hurting himself a lot. Sybil helps with the wound and he tries to show her the scars on his back, but is confused as he finds his back is completely clean. Time passes and Dorian announces the wedding to his noble friends, who appear to be happy, but make excuses not to go to the girls' play. Except for Henry. Along the way, he begins to feel that his friends don't approve of the marriage. And Henry announces that he is going to be a father and that this is the beginning of the end. He takes advantage of the news to take Dorian to an exotic kind of place and goes back to trying to convince him to give in to temptations. Dorian is annoyed, but because he is hallucinating, he ends up not resisting. After that they go to the theater and Sybil meets Henry. She says she didn't see them in the audience and Dorian says they ended up being late celebrating the good news. The mood gets a little uncomfortable when they talk about having kids, because Dorian says they're a little young, but the argument doesn't work at this time in the middle of the 19th century. The bride sees through Dorian's lies and begs him not to go down that road, but Dorian gets nervous and leaves, while Henry looks on from afar like an agent of chaos. Upon arriving home Dorian notices something strange on the board. There was an insect on top and it looked like it was crying. The next morning Dorian was a little sad about the end of the relationship, but Henry makes him forget by showing that he is attracting the attention of several women. Dorian returns home with his friends ready to party, but is interrupted by Sybil's brother Jim, who warns him that she died by jumping into a river while pregnant with Dorian's child. The protagonist is devastated and tries to explain himself, but Jim hangs him until he almost loses consciousness. Dorian's friends and servants save him and Henry arrives to put the house in order. Dorian remembers his grandfather chastising him coldly and begins to blame himself for the deaths of his family members, saying he attracts her. But Henry comforts him again. And once again he notices that his painting now has a dark countenance, in addition to having a wound on his hand while the wound on his real hand had disappeared. He is confused and scared. And that's when a worm pops out of his eye which makes him sick. The next day Basil shows up to comfort Dorian, but he doesn't seem to need it. He also notices that the painting was no longer there. Dorian says he decided to take it out of there because he didn't want everyone to see him. After that, Dorian's behavior changes completely, always encouraged by Henry. At a party, Dorian stays with a girl who was being introduced to society looking for husbands, but her mother misses her and enters the room looking for her. Dorian takes the opportunity to stay with his mother too, all with his daughter hiding under the bed. What makes Henry impressed? Dorian's lecherous behavior continues more and more without limits, doing things that I sure as hell can't show you here on YouTube. At one of Dorian's parties, Basil asks to borrow the painting to exhibit at an art exhibition, but Dorian denies it and says the painting will never leave his house. At another time, Basil asks for the painting again, but Dorian ends the subject by starting a kind of intimacy with his friend. Time passes and more carnal parties happen at Dorian's house. Basil tries to talk to him and is irritated by his friend's behavior, which seems to be getting worse. That's when Dorian decides to show him the painting. Basil is shocked and the protagonist explains that he will always be the same, without aging or scarring. But Basil says that this is the devil's thing and tries to destroy the painting. However, to stop his friend, Dorian kills him. The film snaps back to the beginning and we can see that the person who died was Basil, and that the frame was now decomposing as the painting heaves a sigh. Basil's body is found and Dorian even reads a few words at his funeral. After the service he says he's going to travel and invites Henry, who denies it as he was about to be a father. Decades have passed since Dorian left and all his friends have aged. One day they were in the middle of a party and that's when Dorian walks in. When his friends realize he hasn't aged a single day, they go into shock. He just says that all the rumors they've heard about him are true. Dorian talks alone with Henry, who asks his secret not to have aged, and he says that if he tells, he will have to kill him. At the party he converses with a beautiful woman, who notes the similarity between Dorian and Henry with her pessimism. She was Emily Wotton, Henry's daughter. At nightfall, the protagonist wanders through the city, until he finds Sybil's grave and cries over what happened. When leaving the cemetery, he is followed by Jim, the girl's brother, who seemed to have had a difficult life in all these years. He was ready to kill Dorian, but gives up when he sees that he was too young, so he concludes that it could only be another person. Over time, Dorian and Emily's relationship grows stronger, but Dorian begins to hallucinate and think he's being followed all the time. Then he walks away from her, to protect her from himself. Then he takes a sword and approaches the room, which is now covered in rats and cockroaches, but he strikes a mirror and screams. The next day he goes to church and asks a priest to help him get clean. The priest says that only God can see people's souls. Dorian says he saw his own soul and that it stinks. As soon as he leaves, he begins to be shot by Jim, who chases him to the subway, but before he can shoot, he is run over by a train. Then he goes to Emily and says he wants to tell her everything, but because he's sick, he passes out. The two spend the night on the floor and are caught by Henry. That he's not the least bit happy with Dorian and his daughter. Dorian says he's changed, but Henry yells at him to stay away from her. Dorian ignores his friend and leaves with Emily. Henry stays at home and starts connecting the dots with the help of photographs. And he comes to the conclusion that the painting has something to do with Dorian's youth. Dorian and Emily have a one-night stand, but as soon as he wakes up, he notices that she stole the key and was about to enter the attic. He begs her not to open the door, but she enters anyway. This causes Dorian to attack her, but it was all a nightmare he was having. Sometime later Henry throws a party and invites Dorian. The daughter believes that her father wants to reconcile with him, but he passes by Dorian and insinuates that he knows he sold his soul. In the middle of the party Henry disappears and leaves the guests looking at old photos. Upon seeing the photos, Dorian concludes that he knows about the painting and is heading there. Dorian then runs home and finds him in front of the painting. Dorian tries to come up with an excuse saying Basil's painting was destroyed and that there is nothing important in the attic. He even says that he loves Emily more than anything and that Henry's friendship is very important. However, as soon as Henry finds Basil's scarf bloodied in a trunk, he is horrified. Dorian says it's everything Henry taught him, everything he was afraid to be. He apologizes and tries to kill his friend, who hits him on the head and runs to find the painting, which looks horrible and even growls at them. Afraid, he sets the portrait on fire and lets the gas from the light spread across the floor, then locks the door, trapping Dorian in the attic. But before leaving, he meets his daughter, who refuses to run away without Dorian. She begs for the key, but he just says she owns his heart. Henry drags his daughter out. And Dorian picks up a sword and starts tackling the painting until it pops out of the frame. This scene was very interesting. It's like he's struggling with the darkness of his own soul, getting more and more like the paint with each stroke. He does this until the fire takes over. A few days later we see a conversation between Henry and his wife. He asks him to tell his daughter that he misses her and that her daughter can come back if she forgives him someday. As soon as he turns around, we see that he suffered burns from when he burned down Dorian's house. He goes up to his attic and we can see that he put the painting away after the fact. He just says, "Poor boy. Who can bear to look at you now?" And the film ends with a somber focus on the painting, which is now clean and beautiful as the day it was painted. I liked the movie, both the atmosphere that the director passed and the final scenes were very interesting, but unfortunately you can't say that you really know the story, because several scenes were adapted, so I still recommend reading the book. But for those subscribed to the channel, I'm still planning to make a video, both about the book and about the author, the famous Oscar Wilde. Well, today's video ends here. Thank you so much for watching. See you next time.